The moment he told me to close the door, my life split cleanly in two. It wasn't the words themselves. Plenty of men issued instructions in boardrooms, but the way his voice lowered on the last syllable, as if he were asking a question only I could hear. The conference room was all glass and sunlight, a corner suite high above the city where the afternoon shimmered off steel and blue sky. My hand hovered over the handle, pulse jumping, because I couldn't tell whether he meant the meeting or the tension already threading between us. I closed it anyway. That was how it began. Not with romance or rescue, but with a door clicking shut behind me and the sudden knowledge that I was standing inside a world I had never planned to enter. Before that moment, my life had been orderly, predictable. Safe in the way routines can be safe when they're built around avoidance. I grew up in a small inland town where everyone knew everyone, where my mother measured virtue in quiet obedience, and my father believed distance was the same thing as protection. I learned early how to keep my heart tidy, how to hold myself back from wanting too much. I promised myself that intimacy would come later, after I proved I could stand on my own, after I paid my own bills, after I built something that couldn't be taken from me. That promise became a shield. It was easier to call it a vow. So when I moved to the coast for a graduate internship in corporate communications, I chose work that kept me behind screens and schedules. I kept my apartment sparse, my evenings busy, my emotions carefully filed away. Innocence, I'd learned, wasn't about naivety. It was about boundaries. And then there was the email. A last-minute request. An executive assistant out sick. A temporary reassignment to sit in on a meeting for a private equity firm that leased the top floors of the tower. I was to take notes, manage files, and stay invisible. I wore my most conservative dress and tied my hair back, rehearsing neutrality as I rode the elevator up through bands of light. I didn't expect him to be young. He stood when I entered, tall and composed, sunlight catching the dark line of his hair. He wore a black dress shirt with the top button undone, sleeves rolled to the forearm, the look of someone who could afford not to impress and therefore impressed anyway. His gaze met mine without apology, steady and assessing, and something in my chest tightened as if my careful filing system had been tipped over. "Close the door," he said, and then, softer, "Please." That was the question. The meeting itself was straightforward. Acquisition timelines, risk projections, a potential merger that would reshape half the block. I focused on my notes, on the scratch of pen against paper, on not noticing how his voice changed when he spoke about control and vision. He led the room without raising his voice. The others, older, polished, powerful, listening when he paused. When he disagreed, he did it with precision, not heat. Authority without cruelty. Still, I felt seen in a way that unsettled me. When the meeting ended, the others filtered out, already on phones, sunlight following them into the hall. I gathered my things, relieved until he spoke again. "You're not with the firm," he said. Not a question. I looked up. "I'm interning downstairs." He nodded once. "You take excellent notes." The compliment landed heavier than it should have. "Thank you." He watched me a beat longer, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." I did. Against my better judgment, I did. He introduced himself then, and I returned the courtesy, the exchange oddly formal given the intimacy of the space. The city hummed below us, traffic and voices softened by glass. He asked about my background, my studies, my goals. I answered carefully, keeping my voice even, my hands folded. "You're guarded," he observed. I smiled thinly. "I'm professional." A corner of his mouth lifted. "That too." There was no flirtation in the usual sense, no compliments on my appearance, no invasive curiosity, but the air felt charged, like a held breath. He spoke about the firm, about the need for discretion on a new project, about trust. He asked if I could handle pressure. "I can," I said, surprising myself with the firmness of it. He leaned back, assessing again. "I need someone temporary. Short-term contract, above market pay, absolute confidentiality." My heart kicked. This was not the plan. "I already have an internship." "You'd keep it," he said. "This would be additional." I hesitated. Independence had always been my North Star, but so had caution. I'd built my life on not needing anyone. This offer felt like a door opening onto something vast and bright and dangerous. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you didn't try to impress me," he said, "and because you listened." No one had ever said that to me like it mattered. I asked for time to think. He agreed without pressure, sliding a card across the table. His name embossed, the number direct. When our fingers brushed by accident, the contact was brief and electric, and I pulled back too quickly, heat rushing to my face. Outside, the hallway felt cooler, the ordinary world rushing back in. I returned to my desk and tried to work, but my mind kept replaying the way his gaze had steadied on me, the way he'd said please like it was an invitation. I called my mother that night, a habit I kept out of loyalty more than need. She asked about work, about money, about whether I was being careful. I assured her I was. I didn't mention the offer. I didn't mention the way my chest felt tight with possibility. Sleep came late. Morning arrived bright and relentless, sunlight filling my small apartment. I stood at the window, watching surfers cut lines across the water, and wondered when my life had become so small that a door closing could feel like an earthquake. By noon, I'd decided. I called the number. He answered on the first ring. "Yes, I'll do it," I said. My voice shook despite myself. "The contract." "Good," he replied, and I could hear the smile this time. "Come up at 2. The second meeting was quieter, just the two of us and a folder laid open between us. Terms were clear, expectations firm. I read every line, asked questions, asserted boundaries. He respected them without comment, which did more to settle me than any reassurance could have. When I signed, the pen felt heavy, the ink final. "Welcome," he said, standing. He extended his hand, and this time when I took it, I didn't pull away. His grip was warm, steady. Human. As I left the office, contract in my bag, sunlight spilling down the hall, I knew I had crossed into his world by choice. Not because he ordered it. Not because of the tension humming between us, but because for the first time, my carefully guarded innocence felt less like a shield and more like a door. One I was finally willing to open. And somewhere behind me, it closed. Working in his world turned out to be quieter than I expected, and far more intense. The penthouse office never felt dark or closed in. Sunlight ruled the space, sliding across marble floors and pale wood surfaces, reflecting off glass walls that looked out over the city like a living map. Every morning I arrived early, the skyline still hazy with heat, and every morning he was already there. Coffee untouched, sleeves rolled, focus absolute. At first, our proximity was purely professional. Emails, documents, meetings where I sat slightly behind him, tracking details, anticipating needs. He didn't hover. He didn't intrude. He trusted me with information that made my chest tighten with responsibility. Trust, I realized, was his currency, and he spent it carefully. Still, there were moments, small ones, charged ones. The way his gaze flicked to me before answering a difficult question, as if grounding himself. The way he paused mid-sentence when I cleared my throat, giving me the floor without announcement. The way silence stretched after meetings ended, neither of us moving right away, as if the air itself wanted us to stay. I told myself it was imagination. I had built my life on restraint. I could certainly maintain it now. But restraint didn't stop awareness. I became aware of the cadence of his footsteps, confident and unhurried. Of the faint citrus scent of his cologne when he passed too close. Of the way his black shirt fit him. Not in a careless way, but in a way that suggested intention without vanity. He dressed like a man who didn't need armor because control lived in his spine. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts at the long table by the windows, I reached for a document at the same moment he did. Our fingers collided. This time, neither of us pulled away. The contact lasted a second too long. 2. I looked up, startled by the heat of it, and found him watching me, not assessing now, not professional, curious, careful. "I'll get it," he said quietly, withdrawing first. I nodded, heart thudding, and bent over my notes like they might save me. That night, I walked home instead of taking a ride, letting the city move around me. Sidewalks gleamed under the sun. Cafes spilled laughter and music into the street. I tried to tell myself this was normal, attraction born of proximity, nothing more. But attraction had never made me feel exposed before. I'd spent years protecting my innocence like it was fragile glass. Around him, it felt deliberate, chosen. Weeks passed. The project deepened. Stakes rose, pressure mounted, but never once did he raise his voice. When negotiations went badly, he retreated into silence, jaw tight, gaze distant. When deals closed, he acknowledged the team with a nod and returned to work. He never spoke about himself unless asked. And even then, only in fragments. I learned his coffee order. He learned that I worked better with sunlight than lamps and had the facilities adjust accordingly. He noticed when I skipped lunch and started leaving fruit on my desk without comment. I noticed when he stayed too late and began scheduling brief breaks into his calendar, framing them as efficiency measures. One evening, as the city glowed gold outside the windows, he finally said, "You don't have to manage me." "I know," I replied, "but you don't have to manage everything alone." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once. Acceptance, not surrender. The vulnerability came unexpectedly. It was late. The office was quiet except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant city. I was finishing a report when I heard a sharp inhale behind me. I turned to see him standing still, one hand braced on the table, face pale. "Are you okay?" I asked, already moving. "I'm fine," he said automatically, then closed his eyes. His breath hitched again. I hesitated only a second before guiding him to the chair. He resisted at first, then yielded, tension giving way. I brought him water, kneeling beside him, my hand hovering uselessly in the air. "Talk to me," I said softly. He stared out at the city, jaw tight. "Sometimes," he said after a moment, "control slips." That was all he offered, but it was enough. I stayed. I didn't ask questions. I breathed with him until his shoulders eased, until the moment passed. When he finally looked at me, something raw flickered in his eyes. Gratitude edged with something like fear. "You didn't panic," he said. "I wasn't afraid," I replied, surprised to find it was true. After that night, something shifted. He began to speak more, not about the past in detail, but about loss in abstract terms. About building things because keeping them was harder. About how trust, once broken, didn't grow back the same way. I listened, not trying to fix, just present. In turn, I told him about my vow. About the way my upbringing had taught me that wanting could be dangerous. About how innocence for me had become a form of control. He didn't mock it. He didn't challenge it. He respected it. The closeness intensified, sharpened by what we didn't touch. Almost touches lingered in the air, his hand hovering near my back as we leaned over documents, my fingers brushing his sleeve as I passed behind him, glances held too long, smiles that appeared and vanished like secrets. The midpoint came on a night thick with heat, windows open to the city's breath. Power flickered briefly, plunging the room into a softer glow. We sat across from each other, paperwork forgotten, the moment stretching. "You make it difficult," he said quietly. I swallowed. "For you?" "For me," he confirmed. "Because you see me." I met his gaze, heart pounding. "You see me too." Silence. Then he stood, crossed the space between us, and stopped. Close enough that I could feel his warmth, far enough that nothing touched. "If I step closer," he said, voice low, "I won't be able to pretend this is only work." My breath caught. "Then don't pretend." For a heartbeat, I thought he might kiss me. Instead, he stepped back. The disappointment was sharp, unexpected, and telling. The next day, everything fractured. A misunderstanding. A decision made without explanation. Distance where there had been quiet closeness. He became formal, controlled, walls back in place. I told myself I should be relieved. I wasn't. By the end of the week, I received notice that my contract would end early. Temporary reassignment complete, efficient, final. I stood in the sunlit office, contract termination in hand, and realized that the tension I'd been holding wasn't just attraction. It was choice. And I had no idea yet whether either of us was brave enough to make it. The day my contract ended, the city felt almost cruel in its perfection. Sunlight poured down between glass towers in clean, unapologetic lines, turning the streets into ribbons of brightness. Every surface reflected light back at itself. Windows, sidewalks, passing cars. Like the world was determined to remind me that nothing had broken. People moved with purpose around me, laughing, talking, living inside futures that felt suddenly out of reach. I carried my box out of the building slowly, not because it was heavy, but because I needed the time. Every step echoed with things unsaid. I half expected him to appear, stride confident, voice calm, some perfectly measured explanation ready. But the lobby doors stayed closed behind me, and the silence made its own statement. He was letting me go, or at least he thought he was. The days after were stranger than heartbreak. There were no dramatic tears, no collapse, just a dull sense of displacement, like I'd been living in the wrong skin. I returned to my internship, smiled at coworkers, completed assignments. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I noticed how often I paused before speaking now, weighing honesty instead of politeness. How sunlight through windows made me think of glass-walled rooms and quiet conversations. How the absence of his presence felt louder than any argument we'd never had. I understood something slowly, painfully. What unsettled me wasn't that he had ended the contract. It was that he had decided for me. For someone like him, control was protection. For someone like me, choice was survival. That truth followed me everywhere. I stopped taking the bus and began walking instead, letting the city unfold around me. Cafes spilled music onto sidewalks. Palm-lined streets shimmered in heat. I watched couples argue and reconcile over iced drinks, watched people risk small vulnerabilities without thinking twice. I wondered when I had learned to make safety my highest virtue, and when it had quietly turned into fear. The call came a week later. Bright morning, clear sky. I was standing in line for coffee when my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I stared at it longer than necessary, something in my chest tightening with recognition before reason could intervene. I answered. "Please," he said. Just that word. No authority, no control, no armor. Then my name, spoken carefully, like it mattered whether I stayed on the line. "I need to see you." I stepped out of the line, heart pounding. "Where?" "Somewhere open," he said. "Somewhere you won't feel trapped." That alone told me everything had changed. We met on a high terrace overlooking the harbor, all pale stone and open sky. The water below was a sheet of blue glass, boats cutting clean white lines through it. There were no walls, no ceilings, no closed doors. He stood near the railing, sleeves rolled, black shirt open at the collar, sunlight outlining him instead of shadow. When he turned and saw me, the control I had grown used to seeing flickered, just for a moment, and I realized how carefully he had been holding himself together. "I shouldn't have ended it like that," he said immediately. No preamble, no negotiation. I stopped a few feet away, grounding myself in the heat of the stone beneath my shoes. "Why did you?" He exhaled, long and slow. "Because I was losing the ability to pretend you were temporary." The honesty hit harder than anger ever could. "I've built my life on structure," he continued, "on systems that don't require emotion. You disrupted that without trying. That scared me." "You didn't trust yourself," I said quietly. He nodded. "And I didn't trust that wanting you wouldn't pull you into things you never agreed to." I studied him then. Not the powerful figure others saw, but the man standing in full daylight, stripped of certainty. "You don't get to protect me by erasing me," I said. "I know," he replied. "I learned that the hard way." Before we could say more, reality intruded, sharp and unavoidable. News broke that morning. A betrayal inside his inner circle. A deal compromised. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. This time, he didn't send me away. He told me everything. Not to impress, not to frighten. Just truth, offered plainly, so I could decide what to do with it. "You don't owe me anything," he said. If you walk away now, I will never question it. I looked at him, at the man who finally understood that control without consent was hollow, and felt something steady settle in my chest. I'm not afraid of the world you live in, I said. I'm afraid of a life where I never choose. So I stayed. I watched him navigate the crisis with precision and restraint, not out of dominance but responsibility. I saw how every decision weighed on him, how leadership isolated him, how solitude had become a habit disguised as strength. When it was over, when the danger receded and the truth surfaced, he didn't celebrate. He sagged. That was the moment that changed everything. He wasn't invincible. He was exhausted. Later, in a sunlit apartment overlooking the water, the windows open to the warm air, he stood quietly, no assistance, no phones, no distance. I could lose everything I've built, he said, but losing you would end me. I stepped closer, placing my hands against his chest, feeling the steady proof of life beneath. I'm not something you own, I said. I'm something you choose. And so are you. He closed his eyes, resting his forehead against mine. Then choose me, he whispered. No command, no demand, trust. That was when I told him about my innocence, not as a fragile confession, but as a deliberate truth. I told him about the vow I'd made to myself, about waiting not because I was afraid, but because I wanted my first surrender to feel safe and real. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he cupped my face gently, reverently. Nothing about you needs to be rushed, he said. I will meet you where you are, for as long as it takes. The intimacy that followed was quiet and unhurried, built from consent, from communication, from pauses filled with reassurance instead of doubt. Nothing was taken. Everything was given. When the world finally faded, it did so softly. Morning arrived wrapped in sunlight. I woke beside him, not claimed, not possessed, chosen. His presence was calm, unguarded, real. No contracts, no exits planned. In that quiet, I understood something I had never known before. Love wasn't losing control. It was releasing the belief that control had ever been the thing keeping me safe. Safety came from standing in the light, door open, and knowing someone would stay. Not because they ordered me to, but because they chose to. 1 year later, the light still mattered. I noticed it first because I no longer rushed past it. Morning sun spilled through the wide windows of the apartment, painting the floor in soft gold, and instead of pulling the curtains closed the way I used to, I let it stay. I lay there for a long moment, listening to the city wake up below, traffic humming, voices rising, life continuing in its bright, ordinary way. He was already awake. I could tell by the quiet shift of weight beside me, the careful way he moved so he wouldn't disturb me. That alone would have been enough to tell me how far we'd come. The man who once lived by control now lived by awareness. Not vigilance, attention. The kind that didn't cage, but held. I turned my head and found him watching me, propped on one elbow, black shirt still unbuttoned at the collar, sunlight tracing the familiar lines of his face. There was no tension in him anymore. No calculation, just presence. You're staring, I murmured. He smiled. Not the restrained curve he used to wear like a shield, but the easy one that came when he forgot himself. I know. I didn't cover myself. I didn't retreat. I let myself be seen in the open daylight, unafraid of what visibility meant now. Once, exposure had felt dangerous. Now it felt like truth. This was what safety looked like. We moved slowly through the morning, no urgency pressing us forward. Coffee brewed. Windows stayed open. The city stretched and shimmered beyond the glass, alive and unapologetic. A year ago, I would have been counting exits even in happiness. Now, I stood barefoot on warm stone floors and let the moment be enough. People sometimes ask how love changes you, as if it's a dramatic before and after, a sharp line you cross and never look back from. The truth is quieter. Love didn't make me braver overnight. It didn't erase my caution or rewrite my past. It gave me permission to stop hiding from myself. In the months that followed our choosing, we built something deliberately. Not fast, not carelessly. There were conversations instead of assumptions, boundaries that shifted because they were respected, not tested. He learned how to ask without fear of losing control. I learned how to answer without fear of losing myself. We didn't collapse into each other's lives. We stood beside each other in them. I kept my work, not because I needed independence to prove anything anymore, but because I loved the way my mind moved when challenged. He didn't interfere. He didn't direct. He listened. When decisions affected us both, he invited me into them, not as an afterthought, but as a partner. That word had once scared me. Partner meant visibility, responsibility, the risk of being chosen again and again, or not at all. Now it meant something else. It meant waking up in sunlight and knowing the door wasn't locked from either side. There were moments, of course, when old instincts flared, when pressure rose and he went quiet, when my first response was retreat instead of reach. But the difference was this. We noticed. And noticing changed everything. One afternoon stands out more than the others. We were hosting a small gathering on the terrace. Friends, colleagues, laughter drifting easily through the open air. The city below looked like a promise instead of a threat. I watched him move through the space, relaxed and grounded, no longer carrying the weight of every outcome alone. Someone asked me casually how we met. I felt his attention shift to me. Not possessive, not tense. Curious. I smiled. A meeting, I said simply. Later, when the guests had gone and the sun dipped low but never disappeared, he came up behind me at the railing. You could have said more, he murmured. I could have, I agreed, but that was enough. He nodded, understanding immediately. Our story didn't need embellishment. It wasn't built on spectacle. It was built on a door closed once and opened willingly later. I thought back then about the person I used to be, the woman who believed innocence was something to guard like a fragile object, who thought control was the same thing as safety, who confused distance with strength. I didn't judge her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. But I was grateful I wasn't her anymore. As the year turned, changes continued. Not loud ones, not dramatic. Just choices stacking gently on top of each other. I moved fully into the apartment not because he asked, but because I wanted to wake up there every day. We hosted dinners that spilled into afternoons. We argued sometimes, real arguments, not careful ones, and learned that disagreement didn't mean abandonment. That was new for both of us. On the anniversary of the day my contract ended, we didn't mark it with ceremony. No speeches, no grand gestures. We took the day off and walked the city together under flawless daylight, fingers loosely intertwined. At one point, we passed the building where it had all started. I stopped. He noticed immediately. Do you want to go in? I shook my head. No, I just wanted to see it from here. I realized something then. The place no longer held power over me. It was just a building. Just glass and steel and memory. The meaning had moved with me. That night, as the city glowed softly and the windows stayed open, he asked me something unexpected. Are you happy? He said. The question wasn't heavy. It wasn't loaded with insecurity. It was sincere. I didn't answer right away. I listened inward, to the calm, to the steadiness, to the absence of fear. Yes, I said finally. Because I chose this. Every part of it. He nodded, satisfied. Not because I belonged to him, but because I belonged to myself. And he loved me anyway. Love didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like morning, consistent, illuminating, revealing things as they were instead of disguising them. It taught me that intimacy wasn't about losing boundaries, but about letting someone see them and stay. The door, I learned, was never the enemy. Fear was. And fear lost its hold the moment I stopped locking myself away. If you've walked with me this far, through hesitation, through silence, through the slow unfolding of trust, I hope you felt that truth too. That love doesn't have to be loud to be life-changing. That innocence can be strength. That safety can exist in full daylight. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, breathe, or see something in yourself reflected here, then don't let the door close just yet. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. like if this journey moved you, and share it with someone who believes love should feel safe, chosen, and real. Because the best stories aren't about possession, they're about staying.